Welcome to the Sports Passion Podcast.
Oh, blocked by James! LeBron James with the rejection.
And here's your host, Lars Marendorf.
Hello and welcome to the Sports Passion Podcast. Just like most of us do during the day from time to time, I was checking my Twitter feed a couple days ago. And I saw a tweet that was shared by Daniel Nugent-Bowman, who was just recently a guest, talking about the Edmonton Oilers. The tweet he shared was from John Matisz, and it was the announcement of a new podcast by The Score. That podcast is called When Goalies Were Weird. And it looks back to a time and to the careers and lives of legendary hotheads, superstitious oddballs, and weirdos like Dominik Hasek, Ron Hextall, and Patrick Roy. And I was so anxious and so happy to see that theme there, and I had to get John on my show and to talk about his new podcast. So you will have an interview now that is about how John did this show, how he recorded it, and it's an amazing story. They had about 100 people interviewed for the episodes that will start on November 22nd, and each week there'll be one show. The first 5 will be on one goalie each, and the last one will be a mixture of, I think it's 4 different goalies in the end, and I'm looking forward to listen to that show, When Goalies Were Weird, and I hope you enjoy the interview, and I hope the interview is as good as the show is. So after a short break, John Matisz from The Score. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, there's a new podcast coming, and the guy who's responsible for that and who's, if I understand it correctly, the narrator in that podcast is John Matisz from The Score. John, welcome to the show.
Hey Lars, thanks for having me on, and you're correct. Yeah, I'm narrating it, so I guess I'm the host, and my colleague Nick Ferris did a bunch of work on this as well in terms of research, in terms of reporting, and I also reported on it. So a combined effort in that sense between me and Nick, and then also some other people behind the scenes. But yeah, we're really looking forward to dropping the first episode next Monday, so November 22nd, I think it is. Yeah. The 22nd.
Yeah. Before we go into the podcast, just some information about you. The Twitter handle is @MatizJohn. I will link that. I will also link the show. So if people want to follow you and want to subscribe to the show, that will be in the show notes. But can you give my audience just a short overview of how you get involved into covering hockey and what you're doing for The Score right now?
Sure, Lars. Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I've been in the industry, the journalism industry, for about 10 years. I've more or less always been focused on hockey, my favorite sport growing up. I was into baseball too, but kind of fell out of it. It got a little too boring for me as I got older. And I've always been interested in the game of hockey from an analysis perspective, from a history perspective, and the news that comes out of the great game of hockey, whether it's NHL or international. I've just always been really just fascinated by it. And I started off covering the London Knights in the Ontario Hockey League, so a junior team here in Canada that's produced a bunch of NHLers.
Pretty
well known.
That
was my first job. Yeah, and then I ended up going to Toronto, so to a bigger market, bigger platform, and worked for a newspaper there. Didn't cover the Leafs, but covered the league at large because I had access to players and coaches and managers at the Toronto rink, Scotiabank Arena. And then from there, that snowballed into my current job. I'm the senior writer at The Score. And for those who don't know, we're one of the most popular sports apps and websites in North America. I don't think our reach is super great in Europe, but hopefully, that changes over time. But the app is very well respected in terms of, even if you just want to get scores and information, it's really fast, it's really efficient, it's really nicely laid out. So that's kind of the bread and butter of why people come to the Score is it's right in the name, the scores, and also the news and information. And then I'm part of a team that complements that foundation by writing long form articles, by doing stuff like this podcast, and just by, I guess, bringing more of a journalistic, view or journalistic input to the app and what we provide from a content perspective. So that's the gist of it. I'm based in Hamilton, Ontario, which is like, I don't know, an hour from Toronto, and working from home these days. So yeah, that's what's going on with me.
Yeah, Hamilton was mentioned a couple times as a possible destination for a second team in the Toronto area. So whenever the Coyotes get relocated, maybe that's a place that could be their target there. So there's a new pod in town, and I saw a tweet about that. I read the headline, "When Goalies Were Weird," and I read the names there. Dominik Hasek, Patrick Roy, Ron Hextall, Eddie Belfour, Curtis Joseph, and there's also going to be a episode that covers multiple other goaltenders there as well. And I thought that's going to be fun and would be interesting to get to know you as the guy who's narrating it, but also the reasons and the way you guys produce that. So who had the idea of doing a podcast show like that?
Yeah, so to keep a long story short, I used to have a podcast called Puck Pursuit, and it was long form interviews with, players, with people in the media, agents, managers, whatever, people that were influential in hockey. And it was fine. It did okay. But as you know, Lars, the podcast space is very crowded.
Yes.
There's a million hockey podcasts. Obviously, you, for example, stand out as one who's based in Germany and obviously focuses on German players. But here in North America, it's hard to stand out. So we just brainstormed. Me and the Scores director of content, Rory Bars, just started talking about it and trying to figure out, okay, how can we do something different? We landed on, let's do a narrative podcast. So that involves a narrator and then other voices in the episode, and you stitch it all together, and there's a script. It's very sort of, I guess, laid out. It's not on the fly. It's very produced.
Yeah.
So we got on that. We're like, that's a good idea. And then we started battering around a couple ideas, and Rory came up with, he's a former goalie. He came up with the idea of focusing on these goalies from the past. And we did a bunch of research on, okay, what makes all these guys stick out? What's the common thread here? The sort of the weirdness or the uniqueness of the position, and the strange personalities and the superstitions, and all that jumped off the page to us. And then we zeroed in on the 1990s because there was a changing of the guard, so to speak, with the stand-up goalie. That type of, technique in saving pucks was changing to the butterfly, which obviously Patrick Roy is tied to forever in terms of his impact on the position. So we just thought there was a nice, Venn diagram of all these factors of the position changing, mixed with these great goalies that we really hold in high regard, and also mixed with, some characters and some fascination there on the personal side away from stopping pucks. So anyways, it was basically a brainstorming session that turned into, why don't we look into this and try to make it something special. So we hope that we've done that. The jury's still out because we just have a trailer out, if that has been accomplished, but we're pretty happy with what we've accomplished here, and hopefully people like it. So like you alluded to, we have the 5 main episodes where we're focusing on one guy. So, Hasek, Roy, Hextall, Belfour, Joseph. And then our 6th episode is a bit of a medley of some other characters in the 90s. We didn't want to leave out Brodeur. He's one of the more normal goalies of that era. So that's why we didn't devote a whole episode to him, but we also wanted to end on him. He's the very last guy in the series because he's so important. I mean, he's in the conversation for top goalie of all time, right up there with Juan Hasek, right? So having a guy like Gar Snow, who was very involved in the oversized equipment, was a trash talker. We wanted to include him. Damian Rhodes, superstitious guy in terms of, he wore this leopard print jock around when they were on a winning streak in Ottawa. And Jim Carey is the other guy, the 10th guy on our list. He was a flash in the pan. He was, part of this 90s group, but in a very small way. If you think about it in terms of time, he was only around the NHL for, I don't have it in front of me, but around 5 years. But he won a Vezina. I think he won the Calder. Again, I'm kind of blanking on the particulars. Yeah, and then he just left. He's just gone. So that alone, his story of him sort of falling out of love with hockey is weird. I mean, weird's kind of a hard thing to define, but it's strange, it's odd, it's different. So anyway, that's the gist of it. I mean, in total, we interviewed roughly 100 people between these 10 goalies because we really wanted to understand them. We didn't want to just talk to one or two people and move on. So we hope that the depth of the podcast resonates with people.
Well, when I heard the trailer and when I heard what you guys wanted to do, it reminded me of Shattered, which is, I don't know if you know that, it's a podcast about the New York Knicks, and they narrate the story of the Knicks and what went wrong there with them. And what you guys had in the trailer and the plan there sounded a little bit like that. And I really like the focus on the goalies in the 90s because the 80s were offense, and you mentioned the stand-up goalie, or pretty much you could also say stand-still goalie if you see some of the tapes there. So it was definitely a change. And the interesting thing is you guys are starting with maybe a goalie that has no real style but his own, which is Dominik Hasek. So did you guys do a ranking there? Because that would be one of my questions as well. Who do you think, when you look at those guys, and you mentioned Brodeur, you mentioned Ra, who do you think was the best of those goalies? Not only just focus on the ones you got in there, because I think you can't compare with other goalies from the past, but just from the guys you have in there, who do you think was the best there?
Yeah, well, first of all, we didn't put Hasek as the first episode right off the bat. It was just, we thought, okay, there's just so much there. There's so much content in terms of, he's a really unusual guy off the ice, and then the way that he plays is really unusual. So we thought, okay, if we're going to focus on one guy first, and he obviously has the name recognition as well, let's go after Hasek in that sense. So that was kind of how we landed on that. But in terms of the greatest of all time, I think it's Hasek. I think if you look at his peak, his prime performance, he's named the Dominator for a reason. Like it's plain and simple that he was incredibly dominant. He was playing on a Buffalo Sabres team in his prime that was fine. It was good, but it was by no means great. It was kind of a blue-collar team, a lot of hardworking guys, not a ton of flash. So he was able to elevate those teams, not just, one level up the standings where you go from, I don't know, a non-playoff team to a team that's knocking on the door to the playoffs. He would elevate them from a non-playoff team to, one of the best teams in the league and going deep in the playoffs. The team could cheat. They could be a little more offensive because they knew that Hasek could not only make the first save, but the second and the third. And on top of that, I don't think there is a goalie in history that has played the position like Dominik Hasek. There's been imitators that haven't been quite as good. There's been guys that maybe influenced him, but he is very unique in the sense that he would flop around the crease, but it was very in control. It was, and this is one thing we touch on in the episode right off the top, actually, is that, if you talk to his goalie coaches, so Jim Corsi, a legendary goalie coach, and Mitch Korn, a legendary goalie coach, they both said, sure, if you watch the highlights, you might go, wow, that was lucky, or wow, he was guessing there, or whatever. You just assume that Hasek is benefiting from the hockey gods, so to speak, but he wasn't. He was very analytical, very, very intelligent, and he read the play almost rhythmically, where he would be people would think that he was beaten, but then he would crawl around and save it in a very, I guess, productive way. I don't know if that's the right word, but
Yeah.
He would almost like slither around and pop his glove out or pop his blocker out at the perfect time to kind of sneak up on shooters. But if you're watching it from afar, you go, oh, lucky timing there. So that's one thing that we really tried to get across with Hasek, and I think it really just underlines his brilliance. This is a guy that did not win with the Sabres, famously in the 1999 Cup final.
Yeah. There's
Brett
no
Hull.
Cup winner there, so.
Yeah. So, but he moves on to go to the Detroit Red Wings and wins 2 cups, one as a starter, one as a backup. So the whole conversation about greatest of all time, as unfair as it is to guys like, say, Curtis Joseph, he never won a cup.
Yeah.
But like, you need that on your resume to be part of the conversation. So Hasek has that. He has the insane peak where he's putting up seasons of 937 when the league average is like 906, like just insane save percentages. And that wasn't just a blip on the radar. Like if you talk about Jim Carrey, for example, 1 season, 2 seasons at most where he's a star. Well, guess what? Hasek was a superstar, not just a star, a superstar, best in the world, or one of, 2 or 3 in the world for like 8 years straight. And he didn't stop. It was very long, his prime. So yeah, well, that's a really long answer, but I can see the argument for Waugh, and I can see the argument for Brodeur. Like, I would by no means turn people away or say, oh, you're full of BS if they tried to convince me of those 2 guys. But personally, I go back to Hasek and just, if you were to pick one guy to play for you in a Game 7, I'm going to pick Hasek based on his prime.
Yeah, and you just described pretty much what he is. There were situations where it looks like he just panically throws away his stick and he's just laying on the ground and making saves with his pads there. But that was his regular style of play. And as you mentioned, when you're doing it once or twice, okay, that can be lucky. But when you're doing it on a regular basis and you're successful with that, then it's your style, and then there's a base for that, a reason for what you're doing there. So yeah, that's gonna be a very interesting episode there. And I agree with you. If you mentioned Ra and you mentioned Brodeur, the one thing for me that separates Brodeur from those 2 is Brodeur really never had that peak. Hasek was the MVP of the season. Ra is famous for those Montreal Cup runs there and being the MVP of the playoffs 3 times. But Brodeur, he was never very, very, very good, but he was always one of the best, and he was always enough for those Jersey teams to be a contender there. So there's longevity in there as well, obviously. So he's one of the 3 best, and I don't think that he would have a problem, or that guys would have a problem with Hasek as number 1. And there were a lot of good reasons you just mentioned. One thing that came to my mind when I looked at the list you had in there and talking about goalies, last weekend there was the Hall of Fame induction. And there are very few goalies in the Hockey Hall of Fame. Did that come to, or was that a topic also somewhere in your podcast? And what do you think of that? Why, in your mind, is that the case, that there are just a few goalies in there?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because in the Joseph episode, we do talk about his Hall of Fame case, the case for and the case against.
That was what I was looking for exactly. He's the guy that was always mentioned there.
Yeah, and within that section of the podcast, we do bring up Tom Barrasso, Mike Richter. Like, there's a handful, maybe 3 or 4, maybe not a full handful, but 3 or 4 guys out there from roughly 80 to 95, 99. I guess Joseph played later, but in that pocket of time that have missed out. I think, I don't have the stat in front of me, but I think there's been only 7 goalies inducted since, I want to say 1980. I might be off by that, but it's a very small amount of goalies that have been inducted to the Hall of Fame, in the modern era. And I guess that touches back a bit before the modern era, but nevertheless, there's just not a lot of goalies in the Hockey Hall of Fame, as you alluded to. And I mean, part of that is, I think, just a lack of education around the position in general. Because, I don't know, 95% of people who watch hockey, play hockey, analyze hockey are focused on the skaters because they probably were a skater when they grew up. And there's just a mystery around the position. It's sometimes described as a sport inside of a sport because it doesn't do it justice to say, oh, it's a different position. It's like, no, it's actually a different sport because they're alone. They're working with their own goalie coach most of the time. If they lose, they're the worst player on the team. If they win, they're the best player on the team. That's sort of those highs and lows are very much associated with the position. And similar to a pitcher in a way in baseball, wins are a big thing. Maybe they shouldn't be, but it is a metric that's used for the Hall of Fame. So with Joseph, for example, he has the most wins in the regular season, the most wins in the playoffs, and the most wins total among goalies who are not in the Hall of Fame. So if you want to say that he's not a winner because he hasn't won a cup, well, guess what? He did probably the best he could. I mean, he went to the playoffs a ton of times, was part of teams that upset, juggernaut teams. If you think of the Oilers and the teams that he played for back in the day, going up against the Dallas Stars that would win Stanley Cups, or had a team that was worthy of winning Stanley Cups at least, he stonewalled them. He was really good for the Leafs in the playoffs a couple times. So, yeah, it's tricky when it comes to the Hall of Fame. And maybe a part of that, too, is the selection committee doesn't have enough goalies in the room. It's a very secretive process. Maybe they need, 2 or 3 goalies to be in on the conversation to sort of bring up the right things and to sort of champion these guys who are left out. Roberto Luongo is going to get in as a recent retiree. There's a couple
Lidstrom is going to be.
Lidstrom. So, yeah, exactly. Lundqvist.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was Lundqvist. That's on
we
me.
we both screwed up there. But yeah, I think people listening know what we're talking about. There's a couple of guys that are 100% going to get in, but you do wonder about the Josephs of the world, the Richters, the Barrassos. Yeah. Will they ever get in?
Fleury is one from the current generation that is pretty sure to be in there. So,
yeah. I mean, some people don't think he's worthy, but I think he is, given the cup runs, how far he is up the wins list, what he meant to the game the franchises in Pittsburgh and Vegas. And just as a side note, I know you didn't ask about goalie coaches, but it's there aren't many goalie coaches in the Hall of Fame, and maybe it's something I should know after I did this series, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. I guess Tretiak, but he goes in as a goalie. Like Mitch Korn, he should probably be in the Hall of Fame, and maybe they're waiting for him to retire. There's a couple other guys throughout the years, so that's also another angle to this is, should there be scouts in the Hall of Fame? Should there be goalie coaches? Like, why are we just keeping this to coaches and managers and players? Let's open it up a little bit more. So that's kind of a topic for another day. But
but coming back to your podcast and coming back to the list of guys you had in there, I asked about the best of them, but who was the weirdest of them for you? Because there are pretty hot-head characters in there. Just Ron Hextall is the one where I always remember that there's a YouTube video of him just throwing around his fist and his stick there. So who was the most crazy and most weird goaltender of this group you have in there?
So it's kind of a hard thing to answer because I guess define crazy and weird. But if I really like Ed Belfour's, I guess, story and his what went on behind the scenes with him, because a way to define craziness or weirdness is how they approach the game, how they prepare. And this guy was so into his equipment that he would sharpen his own skates. I mean, there's guys that do that for you. You don't have to do it, right? So he He would sharpen his own skates. He would have his own sort of skate sharpening equipment. There's a thing called a jig, which is essentially it holds the skate in place.
Yeah.
He actually designed his own cowling, which is like the protective plastic on the bottom of a goalie skate. He designed one of those in his free time that would have a removable blade. And he told me that he sold it to Reebok at some point. I don't know, the particulars of it, but like he was that into the equipment that he's out there in the summers designing something, and he's pulling apart old pads and so I find that interesting because it's very behind the scenes, right? He was kind of Hextall like, where he would whack guys in the crease, and all that. Like he had some fieriness to him, which is another component of being weird. And then he would play the puck. So I think just overall with Belfour, especially when you factor in the sort of crazy Eddie side of him, because there's Eddie the Eagle, and then there's Crazy Eddie. There's a reason why he has the Crazy Eddie nickname there, secondary nickname. I mean, he got in trouble with the law a few times. And even if you go back to how intense he was about his equipment and about the preparation, he would sometimes sleep over at the rink because he was there so late and he was coming back so early. So he's like, what's the point in going home? So there was a certain perfectionist part of him that really resonates with me in terms of the weirdness and just the meat on the bone in terms of the story and what you can talk about with him. So Ed Belfour, he's now an entrepreneur where he has a whiskey company, and he's very into the art and science of it, trying to get it right. His whiskeys have won awards. So like he's doing something well, and it just sort of fits his personality, right? This guy was just very obsessive about certain things. And it's interesting that he's continued to do that in his post-playing career.
Yeah, I mean, that's something you often hear, that if someone is very focused on one thing and dedicated to that thing, if that is, for whatever reason, he has to quit that, then he finds something else, and he's very dedicated to that one as well. You hear that a lot about athletes, that if they are competitive, they are not only competitive in hockey, for example, or in ping pong, maybe then when the team plays ping pong. So that's very interesting in regards also to Ed Belfour there. When you look at that group and when you look at today's goalies, do you see anyone coming up, or maybe who is in the league, that is not the same kind of weird but close to it? Or is it more of the same thing that we sometimes have in soccer in Germany as well, that there are no more real characters because everyone is polished, everyone is just from the same training regimen, there are the same strategies, the same things that people look at? Because you mentioned Hasek and you mentioned his knowledge and the way he looked at the game. I would think that he was different there than other ones, and now goalies have a broader knowledge of what they have to look at, maybe metrics they can look at that they didn't have 10, 20, 30 years ago. So if there is anyone from this era that maybe is following the footsteps of those guys, do you see anyone there?
Well, first, you make a really valid point about, these guys being very protective of their brands, being a little more private than they used to be. I mean, even just from a media perspective, you're learning less about these guys and the strange things that they do because it goes viral right away. Like before, it would be, Sports Illustrated is doing a big feature on this guy, and it's going to come out in a month, and it's just going to be in print, and there's sort of just, I guess, less fanfare over it. It's less in your face. So I think that's a part of it, where there might be some very weird goalies out there right now that we don't know much about because the access just isn't there. That said, we talked about Roberto Luongo before briefly, and I know he's retired, but he based on his social media presence and how he showed his personality in that regard, I think that would count as falling into this category of weird or strange or odd or just different. And, he's apparently a really funny guy behind the scenes, so I'm sure there's some stories there. Elvis Merzlikins in Columbus. I'm sure you saw it where a couple of weeks ago or games ago, Igor Shesterkin was about to get a shutout, and the Columbus Blue Jackets were in their own end. They were about to rush up the ice to try to score, but Elvis Merzlikins said, "Hey guys, stop, don't try to score, let him get his shutout." I mean, that's a bit of a strange thing to do. You're supposed to win the hockey game. I know you're down 4-0 with a minute left or whatever, but that kind of is out of the realm of normal, if you will. A guy going out of his way to help another goalie get a shutout. And I know that he has his celebrations that are more, I guess, joyful and jubilant. So I think there's something there with Elvis Merzlikins. Connor Hellebuyck, the way that he gets ready for games. I don't know about you, Lars, and what you've seen, but on Canadian broadcasts, they show him doing the sort of the tracking with his eyes.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a small thing. Maybe that's not that interesting, but it's something. Mike Smith, he scored a goal. That's one thing we talk about in this podcast is the goal scoring. You had Hextall who would try many times and he scored twice. Brodeur scored 3 times. Waugh tried to score a bunch of times but failed. It's less of a thing now, I feel. It's less of a status symbol, if you will. But Mike Smith and Pekka Rinne scored recently, so that's still, I guess, a different way. You know what? I'm thinking about it now. I think Robin Lehner would maybe be a guy who would fit this. And you want to be respectful, right? Because what defines weird, and by no means is his personal problems weird. Dealing with mental health and alcohol abuse and bipolar disorder, absolutely not weird. That is just something he's dealing with. But he is very outspoken about certain things. He is, he goes by this sort of panda nickname. There are some things there that really show that there's a character there, right? And he's a really big guy. The way he plays, I think, is a little different than most goalies around the league. It's more read and react. It's more old school. So I think there's something there. And again, I don't want to call what he's going through weird because it's not. But I think beyond that scope of mental health, he's trying to help other players, like he did with Jack Eichel, for example, getting out of Buffalo. He was outspoken about that situation. I mean, that alone is strange in the grand scheme of the NHL because guys just don't speak out. So there's certainly something there with Robin Lehner. So he would be a guy, and I know he's talkative and he's just I guess a colorful guy. So there must be something there. That would be probably my number one answer.
Yeah, that's a very interesting mention there with Robin Lehner. So When Goalies Were Weird is the name of the show. You start with Hasek on Monday, November 22nd, and every week, every Monday, we'll have an episode up until the end of December. How long are the episodes?
Between 40 and 50 minutes long. Okay. Yeah, and not to cut you off, Lars, but just so people know where to find it. It's on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Google Podcasts, Stitcher, a couple of other places. Basically, if you listen to podcasts, just go to your platform or your feed and type in When Goalies Were Weird, and it's there. And the trailer's up. And like you alluded to, the Monday coming up, the 22nd, that is when Hasek will be there, and then it starts flowing in every Monday from then on. So, 40 to 50 minutes is the general time frame.
And what is next after that? What could be something that is next after that kind of a show?
Like in terms of podcasts at the store?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. This was a fair amount of work, and it's also something new at the company. So I would be lying to you if I said, there's, this and this lined up, because it's a bit of an experiment. Yeah. We're not Sportsnet or TSN where they have big production teams behind, audio and video. We're mostly written. So this is a bit of a departure. We have done podcasts in the past, but we haven't done anything to this extent in terms of the narrative podcast. But if things go well in terms of reception, I don't see why we wouldn't venture down the path of another narrative podcast, whether that's in hockey or basketball or baseball, football. For myself, I mean, I'd like to do something like this again, assuming it's quote unquote worth it from a business perspective in terms of, okay, did people like this? Is it something that we feel like we're good at and that we can improve upon moving forward and continue to put out good content? So yeah, no, there's nothing in the hopper. It's not like, we're not going to release the last episode and announce another podcast, unfortunately.
Well, I can imagine it takes a lot of work into that. I mean, you just said that you had 100 people interviewed, so I can probably estimate how much time that is to set up the interviews, do the interviews, and then select and cut what it's worth to put into the show. And you mentioned 100 people. I don't know. Let's say even if it's just 30 minutes interview, that's a lot of tape you got there, or tape not, but it's digital, but that's a lot of audio you got in there to cut and go through for the podcast. So yeah. And
actually I just remembered, for your German listeners, we did talk to Olaf Kolzig for the Jim Carrey part. So you get some insight there because they crossed paths, they were friends, they were partners. So that just came to mind right now. And in terms of the process, you're hitting on some good points there, Lars. Because I don't even want to count the amount of hours I spent on this, because when you as you know, you got to prepare for interviews, you got to set them up, you have to talk to the people, and you want to be engaging and everything. So it takes time, it takes energy. You got to listen to the interview and identify the interesting parts. You've got to write the script. You've got to record the narration. I didn't do the technical side. I sent it all to our audio engineer. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and I hope that people like it. That's kind of what I'm getting at, right? It's like you put in a lot of work, and some good reception from the trailer coming out. So now it's okay. Do the actual episodes live up to the hype, so to speak? So we think so, and we hope that you and your listeners do too.
Yeah, if the actual show is anything like the trailer, that's going to be a blast. And the interview with you was a blast. So you just said it, and I did it. I just typed in when goalies were weird. So I will put it into the show notes there. I will put the links to your to the podcast there. But again, just like you mentioned, just type it in the title, and you will find it wherever you are listening to podcast. And John Matisz, thanks a lot. At Matisz John, not John Matisz. At Matisz John is the Twitter handle. You can follow him there, and you can follow also on. You can download the Score Your app. So that's going to be something interesting there as well. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to it on each Monday from now on. So that's going to be great. Great for the dark days, the winter days here up to Christmas. So something to listen to, and maybe there's something else you're gonna have on your podcast there as well. Do you have the regular? You mentioned you have the regular podcast. Do you have a regular hockey show for the Score as well?
No. So we kind of pivoted to this. Okay. So I used to do one, but
you mentioned
we decided to focus on this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I can imagine there's not enough time to do both there. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of hockey shows out there. A lot of quality hockey shows out there. So, but this one sounded great to take a look at, and it sounds even greater after talking to you. Thanks a lot, John, for coming on the show.
Hey, Lars, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. You just messaged me out of the blue about this, so I appreciate you taking the initiative, and I was happy to hop on. And great questions, and then really good to meet you.
Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening. Bye, guys.